Hello, and welcome to the third chapter of the book The Sacred and the Profane by Mircea Eliade. I hope you're following along with the reading. Remember, we talked about the sacred in space, the sacred in time, and now we'll discuss the sacred in nature. I hope you're grasping this mindset of Mircea Eliade, which is very similar to Plato's theory of ideas. The perfect model of things exists in the realm of ideas, or the spiritual realm, whichever you prefer to call it. And in the material world, there is a shadow. And there is a tendency for the spiritual world to want to reflect itself perfectly in the material world. And when this is achieved, a perfect bridge, a shadow, the image and likeness of its essence, you have a theophany, you have a point of reality in the midst of an illusory world. You have a point of eternity in the midst of fleeting time. This reclaiming of the mundane, the profane, to realize its essence in the world, to portray the divine in the world, is the theme of the book as a whole. Today, Mircea Eliade will delve into a very interesting topic, which are the so-called theophanies of nature. Points where nature reveals symbols that are very important. Understand, if everything down here is a reflection of perfect, divine ideas, we would need to know how to read the things that are down here. The universe is like a great book to be read by the skilled observer. And when you do this, you have the multiple aspects of the divine, of what we are meant to know of the divine, as if it were a puzzle. So, there is no fact, no situation that does not offer us a possibility of theophany, that is, to see the portrait of the one manifested amidst the many. So, nature is no exception to this. Moreover, there are various aspects that reveal important parts of this realm of ideas, this spiritual claim. And he will talk a bit about these past traditions, and how they viewed nature, how the religious person sees nature. Also, how one finds these sketches of hierophany in every corner, as well as the meaning we inherit from this treatment of nature that the ancients had, how this today. Even without knowing what it means, it often still echoes in our festivities, in our lives, even in our intuition about the value of things, although we have desacralized most of these celebrations. Shall we go? Our conversation today promises to be engaging. So, he will start by talking about exactly what we just discussed. The world is imbued with sacredness, and to contemplate the cosmos is to contemplate countless angles of the sacred and seek to discover what each thing has to offer us. He uses a concept, which is the concept of transparency. What is transparency? It's about looking at things and seeing their essence, looking at a shadow and seeing its model. Therefore, it's like that childhood game where you look at the shadow cast on the wall and try to guess. What is the object that the other person has? In other words, the things of the material world have a transparency, they allow themselves to be seen. They let their essence be glimpsed. All it takes is an observer who is predisposed to see and skilled at decoding what they see. So, the entire cosmos offers an image to be decoded. This is called symbolism. Moreover, another important thing, he will say that nature for the religious person, aside, remember last week, where he said that the religious person is not identical to the person who simply holds a belief. The religious person is the one who reconnects, who builds the bridge, who is capable of creating a link between heaven and earth. That is, he is capable of living the right, which consists of sacred in his life. In other words, he lives in the material world as if he were living in eternity. So, this religious person will say that nature is not beautiful because it is natural as we perceive it today. The religious person does not practice naturism. He sees nature in this way, in its natural aspects. Obviously, that's a tautology. But he sees the supernatural aspects of nature. He sees the representations of God that are expressed through it. And that is the greatest value for him. So, often today, due to a misunderstanding, we attribute to this ancient man almost an ecological character. It's not that he doesn't love nature or doesn't like it, but he sees beyond nature, through it. He has a supernatural vision. And this is a very important point. So, he will talk about many relationships in this chapter. For example, looking at nature and understanding that there is a mother there, and that the respect we have for our own mother should also be extended to nature. And from there, create a bunch of notions of indigenous respect, respect for the land that gave us life, patriotism, a lot of things stemming from this maternal relationship with nature. In other words, nature is a symbol, among other things, of motherhood. And he will unravel a bit of these mysteries that were seen through this supernatural, symbolic observation of nature. I'm a bit hesitant to say supernatural observation because it might seem like it's done through some paranormal means. No. This is done through a mode of human vision, which is symbolic vision. That has a bit of intuition, but also a lot of intelligence. The symbolic vision, which today is so rare, is the ability to see through things what they are meant to represent. The religious man, then, considers that sacredness is the complete manifestation of being. If he were able to sacralize all aspects of his world, he would unify his world. He would cease to be separate things and become one single entity. And he would also unify with this world, finding that point of unity. So, he lives in the pursuit of sacralizing the world around him. And he says that the cosmos has multiple messages to give us as life presents new scenes, new situations. It's a new symbolism, and often we pass by these messages without opening the envelope, without knowing what it contains. And then, it's another story. We can talk about how repetitive events start to happen. Exactly because we are not opening the envelopes that life sends us. So, the cosmos is constantly an invitation to revelation. That we go through this in a very superficial way. He says that one day, when we open all these envelopes, we will understand the mysteries of life, which are revealed through these hierophanies, these well-understood events. And he says even more, and I found this very beautiful, that the cosmos is a portrait of the Creator. Well understood, it is a portrait of the Creator. In other words, the creature cannot be anything other than a perfect shadow of the Creator. And that symbolic vision, which is not something, let's say, paranormal, is a normal thing, a human faculty, could reveal aspects of life through the observation of the whole. In some lectures, I've talked about this, and sometimes I'm not very well understood. I'm not sure how much I'm understood. I speak, for example, of certain trainings that are offered today, like, for example, a leadership course. And what if, instead of taking a leadership course, in not saying don't take one, but before that, take a moment to observe, for example, how our head leads our body. When she thinks about her decisions, does she consider only herself? What kind of consideration does the human mind have in relation to the body as a whole? This gives us certain notions of what a leader is. If we learn to read between the lines of life, there wouldn't be a question that remains unanswered. Why have I suffered so many losses? Why does it seem like things go so wrong for me? Why is my stance towards life mistaken? Imagine that all around you there are countless answers, waiting for you to notice them. When you learn to see through the facts, you don't get stuck on their mere appearance. I'm sure it's a great difficulty for you who follow me, and it happens quite often in lectures on YouTube, that I speak of a symbolic fact, and people see me with historical criticism. But that didn't happen in history. I don't know exactly what happened in history. At some moments, I know, at others, I don't. At other times, not even history is sure of what happened. But the symbolism doesn't lose its meaning just because it lacks historical accuracy. Sometimes, no historical event happened at all. Most likely, there was never even a King Arthur. And the symbolism doesn't cease to be valuable because of that. So, what I encourage in my lectures is that you to leap beyond a mere description of facts. Don't take things literally. This is one of the great limitations of human beings in our days. One of the things he will start talking about is the symbolism of the sky. That's beautiful. I found it very lovely. He says that everything was made to reveal an aspect of the whole. And the sky, in particular, imagine you lie down on the grass and look up at the sky. The altitude, the infinity, the distance from us upwards. It gives us the impression that there is something sacred, grand, very elevated, with a stature much greater than our own. Very similar to what I was telling you in that lecture about the self-taught philosopher. A very beautiful lecture that deals with this, of a man who understands the universe by living alone on an island, simply dedicating himself to reading the messages of nature. And he says then, this enormous altitude, this verticality with which the spirit reaches upwards, speaks to man. A purpose, a fundamental attribute of divinity. It is much more elevated. Not physically, it's not about physical stature, it's about the stature of consciousness. There is an infinity of consciousness above, and that is the divine. Therefore, if I want to get closer to it, I must begin to elevate my consciousness as well. Notice that decoding this literally, which would turn symbolic facts into historical facts, makes us suddenly start to think that the idea of God being in the sky means he is living on a cloud. God is not the sky. Once again, be cautious with naturism. And these peoples did not view God as the sky. They saw the sky as having a divine attribute, which is very important. He calls this a privileged bearer. Why is the sky a privileged bearer? Because it possesses a divine attribute that hardly anything else could embody, which is an almost infinite altitude of consciousness, an almost infinite elevation of consciousness. This attribute is very particular, very suggestive, and very challenging for the consciousness of the religious man. He knows that, to get closer to God, he must ascend. Therefore, you will see in temples, on altars, a staircase that brings us closer to God. It's not that the physical staircase will bring us closer to God. Understand, this is a right. By climbing a physical staircase, I declare to myself that my life will become increasingly ascendant. That my consciousness tomorrow will be a little more elevated than it was today. This is a symbolic fact and not a literal one. Many things that are symbolically wonderful, when translated literally, become reductive and even a bit comical. Isn't that right? In other words, a man does not elevate himself by simply climbing stairs. He elevates himself by making it a right, a declaration of intentions. My consciousness will also rise, with each period of my life, to a new step. Continuing, he will say, once again, the story that it is not about a naturist attribute. God is not the sky. The sky has a divine attribute, very particular, altitude. And he continues speaking. A very curious thing, folks, is that symbolism retains its attributes even for those who do not understand it. Because the effect of symbolism on us is not merely rational. It reaches the human being as a whole. There are spheres of feeling, emotion, and intuition that are not strictly rational, which capture the meaning of symbolism, even when the mind no longer understands anything. So, a bit of that emotion we feel during Christmas, for example, is no longer rational. Moreover, nowadays, the media insists on putting in our heads that Christmas is merely a commercial event or a celebration of a specific religion. And sometimes, if we're not interested in any commercial promotions, or if we don't belong to that religious group, it's as if Christmas means nothing, yet it still holds meaning. It continues to hold significance. Something within us seems to have an opportunity to be born there. So, even when reason no longer responds, there are almost subliminal levels within a person that continue to respond to the presence of symbolism and continue to recognize it, even when the mind no longer understands. And you notice this very strongly in children, who sometimes have an astonishing symbolic understanding. Around adolescence, this is taken from them, this isn't important, this isn't real, this is just a fantasy. This is classic, because today childhood is already being invaded by this desecration. Stories don't exist, Christmas doesn't exist, nothing exists. What a shame! He will continue telling that within various traditions of the past, there was what they called the idol gods. It's important to be well understood. It is said that at a certain moment in these classic cosmogonies, a god, the One, comes and creates the universe. And when this universe is created, when the cosmos is created, he hands over its administration to idol gods. And he only returns when this cosmos reaches its final stage again to be reabsorbed. So, these idol gods, called minor hierophanies, are gods focused on agriculture, the weather, whether it rains or not, sexuality, fertility, etc. But look how curious, because present among these people who work daily with these idol gods, focused on life, fertility, and the perpetuation of survival, when there is a major catastrophe, even if it's a very small tribe in terms of members, they realize that such a catastrophe is not to be handled by the idol gods. And they go to be so-called the idol god. And they remember them. And they ask him to intervene on the events of life, to intervene to bring life back on track, to its correct course. So it's a curious thing, because there is an extraordinary wisdom in that. I remember perfectly when I once discovered that in Egypt, when you visited, because the gods were differentiated according to each city-state, that if you were in a city where the temple was dedicated to Hathor, and you went to another where the temple was dedicated to Isis, the same devotee knew perfectly well that the two corresponded. Batet, for example, they knew what each of these deities corresponded to. There wasn't this conflict. There was an understanding that it was merely a name adapted to that time and space, but it corresponded to the same greatness in various other places. In other words, a symbolic understanding that we have lost today. We've advanced a lot in technology, but when it comes to this metaphysical view of life, we're still way behind. So, he talks about this perfect coexistence between what we today call polytheism, and behind it, the concept of monism. Not losing the notion that at the beginning of everything, there is unity, and at the end of everything, there is unity. In other words, this creator God, this unity, creates multiplicity, creates lesser gods to help beings deal with the matters of life, and New Acropolis, USA, the matters of life. After you sacralize the matters of life, you fit them together like a giant puzzle and return once more to the Father's house with your arms full of fruits. You've already seen a whole meaning in this process, which was well understood by peoples who, to us today, would seem primitive because they had no technology according to our modern conception of technology. Continuing, he will talk about the symbolism of water. Quite interesting. It is said that water predates the earth. It is a source, an origin, without form. If you take Genesis, the Spirit of God hovered over the waters, the Holy Spirit. It is said that water, according to Tertullian, a member of the patristics, a Christian, would have been the first seed of the Spirit. The Spirit of God would have hovered over the waters to fertilize them, and from their life emerged. Water is formless, but all forms were born from it. Forms hover over it, emerged from it, and will return to it. Water promotes the dissolution of forms. It washes away sins, purifies, and regenerates. You'll notice that even the symbolisms you find in certain flood myths, where a very decadent civilization needs to be washed and reborn, you also find in the myth of baptism, in the idea of baptism. So understand that myth, though often seen as something pejorative, actually means a life protocol that has been expressed in a symbolic way. So, to wash oneself in the waters, to leave behind the impurities that have clung to the form, and to emerge purified, to emerge renewed. Water was considered great purifier, allied with the Spirit. It's quite interesting that you'll see one of these, Tertullian again, he said the following, that since the Holy Spirit had used water to participate in the creation of the universe, water would have acquired a special status. Every time the Holy Spirit is invoked over the water, it becomes consecrated, it becomes distinct from ordinary water, as if that original union. This hierogamy had happened again. Spirit and matter, water and fire had united once more. From there, you see this religious symbolism that we still have today, of consecrated water, of holy water. It would refer to this initial moment of water. So, water is where all the seeds, all the latency of life reside. It is where forms emerge from and where forms return to. But provisionally, they emerge again from the water in an eternal return. He speaks of another father of Christian patristics, Cyril of Jerusalem, who says that the Creator in Jerusalem, upon being baptized, at the moment he submerged, he would have stepped on the head of a sea dragon called Behemoth. And by cursing, by stepping on, by subduing the sea dragon, he would have, upon coming to light, opened space for men to also repeat his deed. In other words, he subdues the head of the dragon Behemoth so that men can walk over scorpions and serpents. I found that very beautiful. Anyone who's interested knows everything I say is there. In the book, there is a very extensive bibliography. In the end, he creates a very extensive bibliography with very precise citations. So, what would the Cyril of Jerusalem be telling us? Very similar to something we see in the so-called black work of medieval Albany. By descending into the waters of unconsciousness, we see the crawling forms that threaten us, the forms that poison us, because it is a symbolism characteristic of the scorpion, the one that kills itself, poisons itself. In other words, the forms that dominate us, the forms that crawl, the forms that poison us, by diving into this unconsciousness, by doing this black work, we subdue them. And we return to the world purified, with mastery over everything that is dark within us, which now becomes enlightened. Things are not evil in themselves. They become evil when we do not master them. So, all instincts, all selfishness, if you subdue them, they become a healthy form of self-preservation. Within philosophy, one of the most beautiful things for us is precisely the comparative study. We notice the same idea expressed in various ways. So, the problem is that sometimes people think that making this kind of comparison diminishes some of these traditions. Quite the opposite. Also, it makes all of them spokespersons of a universal truth and endows them with more and more reliability. And we need that. Continuing, he will still talk about the symbolism of water. There has always been, in various traditions, the mythical ancestor who survives the flood and renews humanity from it, from a primordial couple. In other words, this renewal of life when we manage to descend into the underworld, the black work, to subdue everything that was taking control of our lives without us knowing, to emerge victorious from there, to tame our little monsters in the basement and perform the white work. So, these men who overcome the flood and inaugurate a new humanity, they purify themselves, they acquire a level of self-control. And it creates the possibility that, through their example, others can also embark on this journey. Because no one walks the path for someone else. For men can now follow a path that has already been well charted by someone who went ahead, who showed how to emerge on the other side. The hero who descends into the abyss and defeats the sea monster, all the different mythologies that depict the hero descending into a dark place, battling the monster, and rising victorious, would be more or less the same idea. The man diving into this undifferentiated unconscious, mastering the forces that act upon him and emerging. Then, more mature, emerging with greater mastery over oneself, and a greater focus that allows you to keep climbing. Jacob's ladder, step by step, towards the divine. It's interesting that Theophilus of Antioch, another thinker, also a Christian, used to say the following, when people questioned, as there was much questioning about resurrection in early Christianity, he would ask, well, but you see the day rising from the night, that's a resurrection. You see spring and summer reemerging in autumn and winter, that's a resurrection. He used natural facts to substantiate the possibility of resurrection. And that is very beautiful and very valid. At a certain point in the history of all religions, not just one, we'll see that the historical aspect of that religious belief starts to deny all symbolic possibilities. So, at a certain point, the resurrection becomes just the historical character, creator. And the possibility is no longer considered that this historical character is replicating in human form, within human possibilities, a renewal that belongs to all of nature. So, for example, you can't associate Christmas with the winter solstice, where nature overcomes darkness and begins to turn around, because this is often not well accepted. And yet, even if people don't believe it, this symbolism of descending, overcoming the darkness, and beginning to emerge after the solstice happens everywhere, even if it doesn't coincide with Christmas. So, I draw your attention, for example, to the Brazilian São João, which is a typically northeastern festival, very similar to Christmas. Therefore, the gathering of the whole family around the fire, the idea of unity around something spiritual. It's a replica of the reunion with the One, the renaissance of the divine within us. Even though Christmas is no longer there. Without fully understanding, but the symbols of nature never completely die within us. The symbolism of the earth is very interesting, the way he presents it. The myth of Mother Earth, of Earth as Mother. In other words, the association of woman with the earth. A dialogue among mothers, and the ability that women have to possess this empathy, this understanding of the mysteries of the earth, if they understand their own mysteries. Replicator of life. He is going to talk about a tribe of Native Americans. By the way, his references are extensive. I'm just sharing the information here. I'm reproducing all the references. You can see this in the book. He talks about the Delaware Natives. They had a very interesting myth that humanity, in its earliest times, was nurtured in the womb of the earth. And the Creator God did not allow them to emerge until they were ready. He did not allow them to come to the surface to a greater degree of materiality until they were ready. In other words, the earth nurturing the human being until they were ready to come to the surface and face all the adversities of their human journey. This is a very interesting myth, with a close association of the earth with the archetype of the mother. Birth and cosmogony, also an interesting concept. He mentions civilizations where childbirth simulated the birth of the universe, as it was understood in those civilizations. In other words, the cosmos is born from the union of spirit and matter. It is born in a birth. This mystery is reproduced. He talks about the woman who, to give birth, would go to the earth because the earth was a great mother and could help her. She knew how to carry out the process. Of the newborn who, as soon as they came into the light, was placed on the earth so they could find their true mother ultimately. And of the dying who, necessarily when reaching the throes of death, was laid on the earth. Once again, it is the mother who receives him into her embrace. They believed that this cycle above the earth was part of the process. But this process did not stop when one returned to the womb of the earth. The before birth and the after death. It was neither the beginning nor the end. It was a visible part of a cycle that was meant to continue somewhere, in some mysterious way. But whoever understands this half of the circumference can, by deduction, try to understand the half that is underground, in the womb of the mother. The generative goddesses, he will talk about that. Many times throughout history, nature has been so present, so powerful, that it was associated with goddesses who generate the entire pantheon of gods. Goddesses who were often alone, who gave birth to the spirit upon the earth. Many times, those who are impregnated by the spirit give birth to the great heroes, the great gods. He will talk, for example, about mythologies that speak of wise men, of initiates. And when they undergo their second birth, in other words, the first time they were born in body, a second time. They are born in spirit because they are reborn with wisdom. They would enter a cave to simulate in that cave, once again, the mother's womb and then emerge. Hence, the twice born. very similar to the symbolism of baptism itself. They return to the mother's embrace. And then it talks about something very beautiful, which I had already read in various Indian traditions, and to me, this is fantastic. And it reminds us of Confucius and a bunch of other things. He will say that marriage, for example, in Indian tradition, is very significant, but not only there. Marriage is a replica of this eros gamos, this original union between spirit and matter. And therefore, it is a fundamental celebration, because spirit and matter unite to give rise to life, to the forms and shapes that life will inhabit. Not just physical forms, because there are also psychic forms, mental forms, and spiritual forms, according to these traditions. So, when a man and a woman unite, they become fertile for creation on various levels. This could not be trivialized. This is not a trivial fact. Today we'll explore everything, including the so-called sacraments, the so-called parameters of life, the so-called canons of New Acropolis. These moments mark fundamental points where man replicates the process of creation. He emerges from the earth, is born, comes into the world, unites spirit and matter, and creates on all levels. So, this generates the mystery of the creation of forms, of birth, of the forms that serve life. Therefore, this is sacred. Various moments in life. Moreover, by the way, when we read Confucius, you realize how this is present much more in our daily lives than we imagine. We talked about this in previous readings. The sanctification of the way we wake up, the way we sleep, of when we sit at a table to have a family ceremony. These are points of consciousness. Points where we break free from the alienation that usually drags us along and return to our center. What did we come here to do? Are we fulfilling our role? Around what do we unite? These are crucial points to ensure that man does not become alienated and does not lose the thread of life. He reiterates this here. He says that modern man has a lot of difficulty understanding the cosmic and sacred dimension of marital union and the parameters of life in general, and trivializes it. And by trivializing it, joining with a human being, separating from a human being, becomes as trivial as changing shoes. And look, unions between human beings are not like changing shoes. There's a great mystery there. They are human beings. They are much more than we initially imagine. So, this desacralization of life leads to a man becoming empty and falling into an increasingly tedious and meaningless life. The agricultural rites says that the fact of man having fertilized the earth and generated his food there is also a very feminine rite. And to fertilize the womb of the mother. And it allows him fruits, allows him life. And he says that in classical times, and even today, in some more traditional civilizations, life connected to agriculture, in some peoples, this still continues. The rite of planting, the rite of harvest, the celebrations that are not simply about rejoicing because the fruit is tasty, or because the fruit will sell well, because it's a good harvest, but celebrating the gift that nature gives you, the golden fruit of completing a cycle. And to commit to bearing fruit within, while nature bears fruit outside. I always mention a passage that I find very beautiful. Perhaps some of you have seen this movie, which is a beautiful film, worth watching in its entirety. I think there's a specific scene that I find incredibly beautiful, which is a walk in the clouds. There's a particular moment when a family of Mexican origin was celebrating the grape harvest and stomping the grapes to make wine, and there was a salutation to the 4 cardinal points. That is incredibly beautiful. It means someone who has not yet lost the sense of ritual. Remember our last class. Religior is knowing how to bring divine processes into the world through ritual. Those who don't know how to do this are not practicing religior. Those who think that everything they touch in the world is trivialized are not practicing religior. Those who trivialize life are not practicing religior. It's not enough to believe, it's about living. So they know. These civilizations have always known that life comes and goes, enters its cycle of expression, then enters a cycle of retreat, but it's a cycle, not the end. The cosmos is always renewing itself. This brought a great sense of lightness in the face of death. Why is that? The evidence of life that perpetuates itself was always seen through nature. It wasn't information, it wasn't a belief, it was a concrete experience. I have witnessed many births and many deaths and have been a part of them. Therefore, I'm intimate with life and death, and I have no reason to fear them. I understand because I have read the book of life and learned this lesson. This is expressed symbolically. It's one of the many questions you can ask life and find a good answer because it holds that answer. If we are able to perform the ritual, live it, and understand it, we no longer fear the cycle of life. The symbolism of the tree, which is also a topic he discusses quite a bit. So, you realize there are various hierophanies of water, of earth, and he will talk a bit about the hierophany of the tree. What aspect of the divine does the tree represent, which is so often used by various civilizations? There is no shortage of sacred trees. He will say that there is an aspect that is very important. It is rooted in the earth, yet it is capable of facing adversity, losing its leaves, regenerating, going through this long process of hardship until it overcomes all cycles and bears fruit. The golden fruit from the garden of the Hesperides, which Hercules so desperately needed to recover in his trials. What does that mean? A man rooted in the earth, in the material world, but who is capable of rising above the earth. Seeking verticality, seeking to rise to the heavens. And faces all the adversities along the way, yet still, at a certain moment, is capable of bearing the golden fruit, the fruit of wisdom, the fruit of complete human experience. Notice that Hercules, when he goes to the garden of the Hesperides to get these golden fruits, which were guarded by a dragon, usually by a dragon or a serpent, he cannot take them directly. The one who has to fetch them for him is Atlas. The one who has to go there and bring back the fruits he needs is Atlas. And why is Atlas capable of doing this? Because he supports the world, he is committed to the world. This strong commitment to the pain of others, to life as one, as a whole, makes him skilled enough to gather the fruits of wisdom, not just for ourselves. Wisdom is not a selfish achievement. It is not an achievement granted to those who think only of themselves. So, this treats all places well. The tree is associated with this effort to rise from the earth towards the light. And there is a final effort to produce the fruit, the golden fruit. And we're like that as well. The earth offers us the hierophany of being a bridge, even through a highly adverse medium. He shares information that I wouldn't know exactly where he got it from, and it's not my area of expertise, but I found it interesting nonetheless. Mircea Eliade passed away in 1986. He says before that, at the time of writing this book, that all cultivated plants back then were originally considered sacred plants. I don't know if all of them knows, but the fact is that you see myths of the spiritual gain who can, and revealed how to plant wheat, how to plant corn. Depending on the civilization, depending on the region, it is very common for these fruits that nourish the earth, that have fed generations, to be regarded as a revelation. A gift from nature that was revealed because humans couldn't see with their own eyes. They were seen through a divine vision. In other words, man learned to look with a divine vision and also see through a mere plant, such as food capable of meeting the needs of his body. If he looked again, seeking nourishment that fulfills the needs of his soul, perhaps he would find it too. But man no longer looks, no longer searches, no longer feels much of this hunger for elements beyond what nourishes the body. He is going to say something beautiful regarding spring, but spring doesn't have celebrations in all civilizations, almost in distinct way, because this is something very common in the sacred calendar. It doesn't have its celebration just because it's the time to bear fruit. It's the time to be reborn. It's the moment when nature begins to come to life again. It carries this symbolism precisely because it demonstrates the religious experience of wise renewal. In other words, it is an indicator of the cosmic mystery. It shows that life will return. We say life will return. People look and see a withered winter and say it won't return. At a certain point, spring confirms, look, it returns, understand the cycle of life. Life doesn't end definitively, it always returns. So, it is a celebration of a cosmic mystery that becomes visible before mankind. And this religious aspect has always been the main reason for celebrating spring. It's no wonder that today we practically don't celebrate spring, because we no longer know how to see the cosmic mysteries. We have become blind to things of a more metaphysical plane. In other words, we live in a strange society because it develops a lot from a technical standpoint. Technical, to deal with things, and very little from a human perspective, to deal with the spirit of things. Seem too much on one side and too little on the other. Evidently, this imbalance is problematic if a person knows very well how, but not why. Therefore, the usefulness of this might not be very human. It might not be very collaborative for the progress of humanity. He will also say something that this entire book is very interesting, but here he speaks in a very raw and unfiltered way. That the main aspect of the desacralization, in China where he lived, and in certain countries where he spent some time, in certain countries of the East, and in the West, it came from the scholars. It said, people who intellectualize a bit more get too caught up in the appearance of things, which gives them an impression that they know, which is the only thing they can see. And they no longer have the ability to feel, nor to intuit. Just reasoning about appearances. And this generates an intellectual aspect. Disbelief, the intellectual aspect of desacralization. And it spreads through example, which we cannot deny, is a multiplying layer from the perspective of opinions, a generator of opinions. So, both in the East and the West, desacralization, according to him, is the work of the educated, not the uneducated, not of simple, unsophisticated people, but of those who, at a certain point, chose appearance over essence. Recently, I was giving a lecture on artificial intelligence, and I found it very intriguing while studying this, a passage that mentioned that at a technology fair, there was a computer, the so-called strong artificial intelligence, which tries to simulate human intelligence. Moreover, it was a computer with very good expertise in understanding sentences, in understanding words, providing synonyms, providing meanings. A certain American president was invited to go there and say any sentence because that computer had been tested according to Turing tests and a series of other quality criteria. In this field, he was to say a sentence that the computer would provide the meaning for. Then, the American president, whose name I can't recall right now, what was it? He supposedly came up with the following phrase, which in Portuguese is far from the eyes, far from the heart. For the American, it's far from the eyes, far from the mind. Out of sight, out of mind. He said this to the computer. What did the computer offer as a synonym? Out of sight, invisible. Out of mind, idiot. I despise that the meaning of it was an invisible idiot. Now, notice, it's not just a silly story. It shows that there is a threshold that is very complicated, and today, the scientists working with strong AI, strong artificial intelligence, are particularly clear. It is the most refined point of human intelligence, which is a challenge. A challenge for technology to overcome, which is precisely symbolic intelligence, the capacity for symbolic vision. So, AI encounters a barrier there because it's difficult for a computer to develop this, but notice that humans often give up on this as well. One of the most robust symptoms of intelligence is symbolic vision. And, for some reason, in our current historical moment, it's trendy to take things only in a literal and superficial way. And associated with symbolic vision that bridges to something primitive, uncultured, outside the fashionable standards of thought. And already in the 1980s, Mircea Eliade pointed out this problem. But he says that the religious prestige of nature has not been completely abolished. It still exists in small pockets of resistance and as intuition within man. Remember, from way back, even from those who, consciously, seem not to believe and can be recovered. He talks, for example, about the decoration of a house of a person who has a certain taste for the Eastern and does it bear. Sometimes a little pond in the living room and a small mountain with a tiny cave, something like that, or a little garden, because it's beautiful, it matches the decor. He says, well, that little pond, the island in the middle of the ocean, was the symbol. Taoist wisdom from the center, from the necessary isolation for man to delve within himself and then to launch himself into life, to launch himself into the waters, to launch himself into the ocean. A symbol of this moment, where man must go to the center and dive into the deepest part of himself, which is the symbolism of the cave. Enter, reflect, and find, so that you can then go out and share with the world. People look at this and see it as aesthetic, no longer metaphysical. It's simply a cute little thing. But in some way, there still exists, albeit subconsciously, a reason for us to think this and not something else. Therefore, today, we attribute beauty to what offers us a certain sensory pleasure, and not to what offers us a certain possibility for deep reflection. Plato said that things are beautiful because they evoke a sense of nostalgia in us. We see through them and feel homesick. And it's more or less what Mircea Eliade recovers here. He will create another hierophany of nature, which is the hierophany of stones. How many times have precious stones, sacred stones, been at the center of various mythologies? He chooses the attribute of the stone, which allows it to be a symbol of the sacred. The capacity for power, firmness, permanence, and sometimes resistance. Take a diamond, for example. Its internal structure is so perfect, it becomes extremely resistant, capable of cutting glass. It's no coincidence that in India, the diamond is known as the Vajra, and in Tibet, the Dorj. A brilliant mind is like a diamond mind. That cannot be penetrated by anything foreign in any way, because it is very resistant, but it radiates its light outward, which is infinitely brilliant and reproduces all the light it receives. This is considered the mind of the wise. So, the earth offers a possibility, one or many possibilities, of decoding the divine through its behavior. The hierophany of the moon and the sun. The moon is very interesting because it is the thread of life, life in all its cycles. So we, humans, have light and shadow, we have dark moments, we have luminous moments, what the philosopher Nicholas of Cusa called the coincidentia oppositorum. In a single human being, there are moments of darkness, moments of light. They go through all of it knowing that ahead, the light will return, just like the lunar cycles. So, the moon shows us that life is cyclical and repetitive. If the light has disappeared now, in some way, we need a bit of darkness to dive within ourselves. But it will reemerge, victorious. In other words, we'll not lose the connection with the thread of life. But he says there is another lesson in the sun. The sun does not offer the lesson of cycles. It offers the lesson of permanence and fidelity to the light. It always remains what it is, luminous. It may disappear on the horizon, but we know it hasn't darkened. It continues to spread its light in some other part of the universe. It battles the darkness on the other side of the world, reemerges victorious, and ascends to the heavens, the ascension of the glorious body. He speaks of countless beings in history who, being clearly linked to the solar, religious masters, heroes, followed exactly this path. They dive into the battle against the shadows, re-emerge victorious, and ascend to the heavens. So, the sun is that which always remains faithful to the light, and the moon is that which goes through phases. This reminded me of an experience from many years ago with a professor named Mircea Eliade, who brought new Acropolis to Brazil. On one occasion, he spoke to me personally. It was a very interesting moment when he said, "Look, something within us. It's like the geography of the earth, with peaks and valleys. But something within us is like that sun, which remains always unshakable, no matter how much our earthly body rises and falls. Therefore, when your psyche is exhausted from so much rising and falling, take your consciousness. Then place it in that which always is, always exists, in that which always remains. In other words, it's a solar symbolism of the lunar essence, of our existence. Essence versus existence. What we are and what we are becoming. What we are becoming will live on. Cycles are typical of the Earth's geography, and what we are is unshakable, and we must know how to reconcile the two, and draw experience from both worlds to reach unity, which is not just one. It's the marriage of the two, and it is the classic hierogamy. Well, and finally, today we are left with this. Understand that, with everything he said, he reiterates the same idea. The world is not random, the manifested world is a shadow of the sacred. We are here to learn to read the heavens through the earth. And every time we make this reading, our consciousness is elevated. That this path reaches a certain point where heaven and earth unite. And by understanding this, we are able to see through appearances. The man who remains seeing only appearances will be subjugated by them. He will live in a world of opinions and never of wisdom. And wisdom is the pinnacle of Jacob's ladder. It is what leads us once again towards the fullness of our human nature. It is what brings us closer to God. We'll stop here for today. I hope you all are reading and keeping up. Don't forget, we only have one more chapter. We will finish this book next week. Thank you and a hug.